Hey there, it's Rod Yates here. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Humans of Music, a Jaxsta podcast. Each episode, I talk to a music creator or industry professional about their life and career, the ups and downs of their journey, and the lessons they've learned along the way. And my special guest today is producer and multi-instrumentalist with Empire of the Sun and PNAU, Nick Littlemore. When Nick Littlemore was a teenager, his life changed when he discovered Sydney's underground dance scene. For someone who'd grown up feeling like they didn't fit in, Nick had found a community and a form of music where he felt like he belonged. Alongside school friend Peter Mays, he formed the electronic band PNAU, who've gone on to become one of Australia's biggest acts. But Nick is a man of many interests. In addition to founding his record label, Lab 78, which is focused on supporting up-and-coming artists, he's also a prodigious collaborator, working with everyone from Beyonce to Sir Elton John. In fact, PNAU scored a UK #1 in 2012 with a remix album of Elton John songs called Good Morning to the Night. In the mid-2000s, Nick co-founded Empire of the Sun with Luke Steele. But instead of going on the road with that band when they had a big hit with their debut album and the song Walking on a Dream, Nick opted to move to Montreal and spend years composing the music for the Cirque du Soleil production Zarkana. We talk about all these experiences and more in this interview, which took place in Sydney in June before Nick flew back to the US. Now, being in Australia, the time difference means I've done a lot of phone and Zoom interviews at very strange hours. But never before had I been asked to do a face-to-face interview at 8 in the morning. But as you're about to find out, there's a first time for everything. This is probably, I think, maybe the earliest face-to-face interview I've ever done, which suits me fine because I'm an early riser as well.
But good. Yeah, I rise at like 5. So this is right up my street.
Yeah, I'm a 5 as well. Why do you rise so early?
I think it's clinical depression, but it might be a combination of things. It's weird. I lapse into whenever I have jet lag, I usually stay in whatever that lag is for months. And since I've been in Australia and the COVID thing, I've actually most mornings I wake up around 3:45 and just sit there in the dark for a while. Yeah, I don't know.
Thinking or working or?
Yeah, like now that my wife's come back to the States, I can get up and work, but most people don't wake up at 4 a.m. But when she was gone, like the first few weeks, I'd get up at 4:30 and just start work. And I couldn't get a coffee till like 5:30, 6 a.m. So yeah, I just start work. And then by midday, you've done a ton of work,
right?
Which I enjoy. But playing shows late at night has been really difficult for me to stay up.
Yeah, to stay up to actually do the show.
Yeah. I'm like in the fucking twilight zone.
Really?
Yeah.
Does that help with your performance? I mean, sleep deprivation.
No, I mean, I used to love sleep dep when I was younger, and I was traveling a lot to England working with Darren Emerson from Underworld, and around that time I would stay up for 4 days and smoke a ton of weed, and I could stay up for 4 days and work, and I loved it.
No sleep at all.
No sleep. Now I need to nap like all the fucking time. And then I don't nap and kind of fight through it or whatever. But just feel that the crushing weight of sleep debt working into me. But yeah, when I was younger, I seemed to have an endless supply of energy.
What state would you be in at the end of the 4 days when you hadn't slept?
I mean, it was certainly, I'd like to think it was a higher state of consciousness, but it was certainly an altered state. I think maybe similar to like being on blues, like codeine or Valium, where you're not completely there. And I think there's some element to music making that it's actually good to be removed from self, removed therefore from ego. When I make records, I often, doing a ton of them at the moment, working with young singers and young artists, and try and impart some knowledge and things I've learned over the years. But one of the main things for me is instinct. What I mean by that is when I play them a record, like a chord progression, whatever it is, for them to sing over, I don't play it to them until they're on the mic and they're ready to go, because I want to hear what they do the moment it comes into them. And for me, it's like a precognitive thought. It's like before your ego has had a chance to make sense of anything, your spirit or whatever, I don't want to get too like new agey with it, but there's something else happening that isn't necessarily filtered by all those things that we've grown up with, all the things we've heard, all the other stuff that goes into who makes us who we are.
Right.
And I'm less interested in who we are than maybe what we could channel before we, curate it, if you will.
Sure. When did you figure that out?
I think I'd always kind of done it, but I think in the last sort of 5 years, I started to realize there were sort of techniques that would work. And so some songs have come out like that over the course of my career. And like Walking on a Dream, I sung most of, not the chorus. Luke wrote the melody for that, but the verses, it just came out of me. And the words were largely right. And it just felt right. And there's a song called Baby, which is Changes now, which is a PNAU record. And it was very similar. And I don't know, it's just something about, I try it with every young singer who's open, and I really hate people that aren't open. I find it such a drag. I just want them to try things. You know, it doesn't hurt anyone to try things and experiment. It doesn't always work, but when it does, you get something that they're surprised by, and that creates an enthusiasm and a kind of point of difference.
Okay.
You know?
Working with young artists is something that you seem to be doing a lot of now.
Yeah, I
Helping
enjoy it a
artists.
lot. I mean, I work with artists from sort of, I guess, all different ages. I mean, this industry is quite ageist, which is a drag. So, I think there's a lot of older artists that are incredible, and I love working with them, but it's probably more of a selfish thing. I want to learn from them. And yeah, I can learn from younger artists, but I feel like I'm more in the role of trying to pass on some techniques that will help open up their discoveries, you know?
And are there, I mean, every artist is unique, but are there certain sort of key pieces of advice or key things that you think are relevant to all of them?
Kinda. I mean, for me, the most important thing, and maybe because I'm not as gifted or as talented as a lot of people I work with, the most important thing is turning up. And a lot of artists give themselves what I call a pass. And they reach a certain level and they'll kind of take breaks. And I don't know, I work 7 days a week.
Okay.
I mean, much to the detriment of everything else in my life. But this is my life, you know?
Yeah.
I love working.
Yeah.
And that's what defines my path in existence. Yeah, so I don't know. I try and impart that you need to work harder.
Okay.
And you need to have multiple avenues. You shouldn't just have one project. Don't put all your weight on one thing. Because I think a lot of people, they think this is it, this is my thing. And I go, yeah, but maybe one day a week you could try something else. And maybe instead of being the singer, even if they're fabulous singers, write for another voice, because it will do things that your voice doesn't do. And that will be inspiring. And your artistry, you know, much like mathematics or writing or any other thing, it can be interpreted in other ways. And you can end up with something equally as beautiful, but different. And I think that we don't have enough of that. And a lot of singers that are really good will come to that later in life, but I want them when they're young and they're all fresh, full of stuff, full of ideas. And, you know, 90% of the stuff that I pass on to people, they just disregard.
What do you mean?
I don't know. I was thought about writing some kind of manual. I always loved the KLF little book that told people how to write a hit. And I wouldn't necessarily know how to write a book that would tell you how to write a hit, but it would tell you how to unlock creativity in different ways. And it's something I've really invested in. And I think it can be applied to a lot of different practices, not just music or even not just the arts per se, but just creative thinking and ways of getting through some kind of block, whether you're looking at an architectural space or really anything, even just problems in your own life, just approaching things from a different angle. And yeah, I guess probably part of that has come from my use of psychedelics and meditation and just other ways of thinking outside of the norm, you know?
Well, I mean, the psychedelic use is interesting because as someone who doesn't use psychedelics and hasn't used them, I'm fascinated by reading about your experiences with them and how they've opened up new worlds to you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'd used them a lot as a kid, and then I had a lapse for about 15 years, 20 years, and then I got back into them, and in a very different way. As a kid, you're just doing everything because it's so fun and it's so wild, and you want to be rebellious for whatever reason. But then coming to it later in life, it was much more a respectful place to be, and I would try and really take it very seriously and look after myself in the process of it. But I found that it brought back all these memories I'd forgotten, parts of my life that had been frittered away from just years of working. And, you know, I feel like my brain can't fit that much information in at any one time. But when I go on one of these journeys, and some of them are very short, you just come back with all this renewed excitement and exhilaration for doing what you're doing, a greater purpose for it. And yeah, it's probably the most enriching part of my life other than my family, you know.
Are there certain psychedelics which work better for you?
I mean, yeah, I've probably mushrooms I do like, but I find them confronting. You never quite know. And they can beat you up a bit, and you can see some stuff you don't want to see. And that's quite common, but I feel like it's like watching a cloudy sky. If you watch it long enough, it will shift and it will change. And then even if you go to very dark places, then that will also shift. And I'm always reminded of the George Harrison record, this too shall pass, you know, and it feels like that. So you're kind of in a theater watching things, which I enjoy, but I don't enjoy the nausea, the sort of the stomach issues you can have in the first hour and a half of that trip. I really do like DMT or Changa, which is only a 20-minute trip, but it's incredibly powerful. So it's not for the faint-hearted. And a lot of it you can't make sense of. It's like a flash. They call it the DMT flash, and it just you explodes your mind. And one of the first things you notice on that is that your vision, the clarity of your vision gets much stronger. Like you can see higher resolution than us as humans are capable of seeing, which is just a mad thing even itself. Before you're even really seeing things that aren't there or are there that you can't see or whatever, it's almost like we were seeing things on YouTube from a decade ago, and now you're seeing things at 8K resolution, like unbelievable resolution. And just the pure beauty of that is so overwhelming that I always end up smiling so much that my cheeks hurt so much from smiling. And I like that Terence McKenna says, oh, well, you know, is DMT dangerous? And he says, well, the only issue is that you could have death through astonishment. So you would be so overwhelmed by how incredibly beautiful the experience is. And that's just something that I had never had as a kid. I'd never even really heard of it. But it's something that it's very important to me. I don't do it very often. Once, maybe twice a year.
After you do it, does your creativity surge?
It does. And more than that, I think my positivity. I've always suffered from depression from an early age, and it keeps me in check. It keeps me in the flow of nature. I think I want to spend more time in nature, and it brings me back out of the studio into those places, into, I guess, a greater understanding of my relationships and what I'm here for and what we are here for, I think.
And you mentioned depression, and I've seen that you've spoken about that as being one of the big influences on your creativity.
I think it's a huge influence for me. I feel like I'm very empathetic, and but I'm also pathetic at the same time because I get very depressed, and I'll fight through it and I will work with it. You know, depression, I don't know, in some ways people can view it as kind of a cop-out and, you know, man up and all that kind of rhetoric that we've heard so often. And I try and work through it. I try and make something positive. And often when I'm in a very dark place, the best thing for me to do is to write and is to go into a room with people and work, because I'm forced to do something. And you're not going to write about sadness. I mean, occasionally I'll write something like that and then I'll just kind of scrap it. I try and write it. I write every day anyway, and you always have something different to say. But when you're in those very dark, black moments, you are forced to write something full of light and full of joy, because nothing else would make any sense. There's no point digging a deeper hole for yourself. It feels like a moot point.
It could easily go the other way. It could easily go into digging a deeper hole for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do that anyway, but I don't think in the writing.
Right.
Because I think there's something about, and a lot of the writing I do on the spot, just with my mouth, just by singing, there's something innately positive about projecting, even talking, but particularly singing. It requires a lot of work from your body to do it, you know, and I'm a pretty bad singer, but God bless, with all this new technology, I can sing really well. But it requires a commitment, and depression steals a lot of commitment. It steals a lot of ability to make choices, and making music is all about choices. So I like to force myself into those moments, and I usually come out by the end of the day feeling so much better. And you come back to your baseline and it's almost like you're on ecstasy because you're so happy that you're actually not in that slump anymore.
Are there particular songs from throughout your career that you've written in that state?
Walking on a Dream was written in that state. I was living with Luke over in Western Australia. He had rented a warehouse to the west of Perth, and my girlfriend at the time was away, and we couldn't talk much because I think she was in Brazil or something. And I don't know, for whatever reason, not being able to communicate with someone who's far away, who you care about, it became overwhelming. And I'd recently broken my sternum, so I was taking a ton of painkillers, which, send you into a bad place anyway. So that all combined, and then Jono, who wrote the backing track to Walking on Dreams, sent me this email with the song on it, the backing track, no vocals, no melody, and put it on and just sang it, and it just came out. And it was like finding a hole in the storm. It just presented itself. I feel like that's a really clear moment where I was clearly in a dark place, and the music and my connection to it and that whole kind of ecosystem I was living in, this was really weird. I was sleeping on tables. It was basically living in a factory. But I was in my 20s, you do stuff like that. And I was in constant pain because of the sternum being broken. But it all came together and it felt like it was all meant to happen at that time.
You mentioned earlier that you're not as talented as some of the people you work with, which I think is
it's a blessing.
Subjective.
Well, I just think it's a blessing because I'm okay with knowing my limits. And it was something that my grandfather told me. It was one of the only conversations we ever had. And he said to me, surround yourself with everyone that can do everything that you can't, and you'll never fail. And it's just the only piece of advice I've ever taken on really in my life, is to know my worth or lack of value. And I'm good at a few things, but I always collaborate because I know there are other people who have spent much more time at the piano, or they've spent much more time just purely singing or playing bass or mixing or whatever, or the visual side of things. I have ideas, I have things to offer, but I'm always interested in collaboration. I think music is a communication. I think it's the oldest form of communication. I think singing brought the universe into existence. I don't know who sung it, but I've heard music like the Moorish music of Mauritania. It sounds like singing the cosmos into existence. And I believe that if you surround yourself and you know your worth, know what you're good at, and that can take some time. Some people go, oh, I'm good at everything. It's like, well, clearly that's not true. And you might be okay at everything, but it's better just to kind of get great at something.
And is that what you're great at, collaboration and production?
Yeah, I mean, I can be. It depends on personalities. I'm working with a young singer at the moment from the States, and we're having a great time making music together. And I'm pulling tracks in from other people, and the two of us are really workshopping vocals. And that's what I found my place these days. It's all just in the vocal for me, because it's always been about the words and the message as well as the melody, but the energy of the vocal, because I feel like it carries everything. And you can have a great instrumental track, but without the right vocal on it, it's really not going to communicate with that many people.
Sure.
I know that, yeah, okay, you can say Tubular Bells is one of the biggest records of all time. There are exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, we want something. And for me, as an empathetic person, as someone who's very emotional, the vocal draws me in, and I feel like that courage. And when I go in to sing on something, I do see the tens of thousands of people out there, whether I'm playing stages of that level or the songs that I've written have ended up reaching that many hearts. And it's an incredibly emotional thing to write the right song at the right time. It's changed my whole life to do those moments. And I do think, and incredibly sad as well at the same time, but it's just like that overwhelming emotion. I can't escape it.
What's sad about that moment?
Well, I think partly because when you're making something that you know is incredibly special, it's going to be a huge gap until you do that again. And the fact that it is bringing people out of a bad place, and I have countless emails and messages from people who've said, oh, this song or that song has really helped me through my troubles. And you're just thinking of all their troubles. and just, I always call it like the infinite sadness of the world. And you can get it from drinking whiskey or from gin, but also in the moment of creation because you're so open. And I always used to say you have to be broken in order to be open. A little bit like the Leonard Cohen quote that the crack in the jar lets the light in. It's like we have to be a little too far gone in order for the magic to really happen. And
Sure.
maybe he's attributing it like I am to, you got to be depressed and on 3 codeine to make something great, which I don't think is true. But at the same time, there is that overwhelming emotion. And it's similar to psychedelics. Like you're witnessing something unbelievably beautiful, ineffably beautiful, that it makes you weep.
Is there a temptation to think when you have a breakthrough like that perhaps you need that depression? You need that
Well, I
turmoil?
hate that line of thinking. And it's a bit like saying, I need to get high to do something good, or, I need to recreate this thing. And yeah, I've fallen prey to that many times, to thinking, okay, there is a sort of perfect storm that one can create. And then if you do that, and you see that in kind of kids' movies or sci-fi films, like, oh, the alignment is just right. And then the light will come through here, like Raiders of the Lost Ark or something. But I don't think it's the case. I think you can always make something beautiful, and you can will yourself up, to swim upwards. It just happens that, some of those moments have come out of adversity.
Sure. You mentioned your grandfather earlier. And I understand that both your grandfathers, one was an engineer.
He was, yeah.
And the other was, he worked on the design and construction of the Sydney Opera House.
Yeah, when Utzon fled because he hadn't paid tax here, and it was about midway through the construction and design of the Opera House, my grandfather took over his firm, Hall Littlemore and I can't remember the name of the firm. Actually, that's terrible of me. Anyway, they took over, and he was the chief architect in charge of making it structurally sound and finishing all the design for the interiors, and huge job. And actually, there's a story that basically when he started, because it was so overwhelming, and it was one of the biggest construction jobs, I think, certainly in Australia, other than the Harbour Bridge at that time. And because it's a lot more, it's a one-off thing. So learning how to make that work with the sales and everything else. He started drinking whiskey every night, and he started drinking a bottle of whiskey every single night to get through it. And his wife noticed this and started drinking with him just to slow him down a bit. So I think in a way we have a similarity in that the way we cope with stress is maybe not the healthiest way, but we'll get the job done. We'll get through it.
Right.
But and obviously what he did is 10 times as difficult as what I've done. But it's similar to, I think, working with the Cirque or doing anything that feels overwhelming when you start it.
This is Cirque du Soleil?
Yeah, there was 170 people in the cast, and a director who was a challenging individual, full of ideas, but finding the reality of those ideas is a whole other thing than just dreaming. I found it very challenging 3 years of my life to do that straight after Empire came out, and I should have just been lying on a beach somewhere having a great time, but decided to move to Montreal in the dead of winter and try something that was so far beyond my means. It's insane, really.
I do want to talk to you about that and that decision to do Cirque at that point in your career, but just going back briefly to your grandfathers, and I guess having that level of creativity in your family history. I mean, do you think that being in the orbit of that, or even having that in your lineage, sort of impacted you in terms of where your interests lay?
I think I'm not sure if you can pass it down so much as knowing there was a legacy, and something that I thought and still believe is important is legacy. Even though I'd probably class myself as an optimistic nihilist, I don't think there's much after we pass. But I think knowing that you could achieve something that seemed so great willed me on. And I think I got my work ethic from him. And I think the fact that he took the time to tell me, surround yourself with people who can do everything you can't, is another way of saying kind of know your worth, and that you have worth. And toil. I think we're here to toil. I think we're here to work ourselves to the bone. Like, I really believe that. I have some very strong views about people that might, kids, and I've seen a lot of them who've inherited a ton of money, and I feel like their thunder gets stolen because they don't they don't have to toil, and therefore most of them don't. And I think it's a very unfair thing that happens to people. I think that it's so rare for someone that inherits a bunch of money to then take that on and go and work their ass off and do stuff. And I really think we're here on planet Earth to work, whether or not we're meant to do it in an office or we can do it just in the land or however you do it, and whatever it is for you is different. But to spend that time and like that deep, passionate time doing something that moves you and ideally helps the world out, does something good for the planet or for other humans, to lift people up. I feel like that's maybe certainly my purpose.
Did you feel that early on?
I don't know. I feel like as a kid, I was so confused by high school, and I hated the monotony of homework and classes, and I didn't get it. I didn't know why to do it. And, I look back at it now and I think some days I'd find myself in some swimming carnival, and the next I'd be in some math class I didn't understand, I didn't want to be there, or reading some book that I hated, or getting into trouble all the time. That I feel like the rebellion of running away and going to raves on weekends was suddenly I was surrounded by all these people I didn't know who were older, but they were kind and they were lovely, and the music was incredible. It was taking me to all these different planets and all these different places. I feel like that was such a powerful moment in my life. And it felt rebellious, not only the act of doing it, but the fact that I could give my life over to something that felt frivolous in some ways, but you could come at it with passion and you could bring something out of it. I had no idea that I was going to end up writing songs. Peter and I started making music, I think, when we were about 14.
It's Peter Mays from PNAU, yeah.
And we had a few little keyboards that were so cheap at the time, and now they're worth, thousands of dollars. And we didn't know what we were doing. We just started making things, doing things, trying to emulate what we'd hear. And I think for me, I always saw it in colors. And I wouldn't say I'm really exactly a synesthete, but I would always have a feeling of colors or landscapes. And that's what drove me. It was sort of employing story into sound. And I loved cinema. Cinema was the big thing that always moved me, and I always wanted to go into cinema. But it just didn't work out that way. The path felt like it was determined, but not. I don't know if the individual determines their own path. It certainly hasn't been the case for me. But whatever I have done, whenever I am present, I'm intense about it.
Okay.
I just go full on into it.
You mentioned that it was predetermined, your path, that you didn't really have a say in it. What makes you think that?
Well, I always thought from the youngest age, I started doing photography when I was about 10 or 11. And then I moved into film, started making Super 8 things, and I won a few awards. And I felt like that was where I was meant to be. I wanted to make films. I never wanted to be in front of the camera. I wanted to make them, wanted to write them, wanted to direct them. And I started doing the scores with Peter to some of these movies I'd made. And someone heard the music, and then it just kind of ran away. And the movie making just took a back seat and a further back seat. It's sort of come through a little bit with music videos, but it's really not the same thing. And it just felt further and further away from ever becoming a reality. And one of my best friends at school, who started making films with me a little later than I did, and then he just went on and on and on, and he's just had a film that he shot. He's a cinematographer that got nominated for Oscars, and it won Golden Globes. It won an Oscar, actually.
What for?
It's called Minari. It's a Korean-American production. And he really, it's the fulfillment of kind of both of our childhood dreams. And he just stuck with it. He's worked so incredibly hard, and he's got there. And I can see how my career to a lot of people, especially someone as serious as that, does look really frivolous. Because you can go in, some songs have been written in an hour, and you're making a film. It's like 18-hour days for 6 months. And then you've got the fight with the distributor and all that other crap. Like, oh my God, I can't even fathom how hard that is.
Do you think you'll return to it though?
I love writing stories and things, but to write a larger body of work, I find it so challenging. I can write short stories about 12 pages. I love it. but I've never managed to eclipse that and have that concentration. Part of me thinks I need to become an alcoholic. But see, that's just a stupid idea, isn't it? Full of stupid ideas. Full of ideas, most of which are stupid.
After the break, Nick talks about the rise of PNAU, his relationship with Sir Elton John, and his work with Cirque du Soleil. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Nick Littlemore. So you've started making this music with Peter in your teens, and then you start sort of, I guess, continuing to experiment, and you release a couple of singles that get put on compilation albums. At what point is this starting to become, in your mind, all right, we've got something here. We could have a future here?
Oh, well, I think the very first stuff we were doing, we were emulating what we were doing at the Doofs, the Vibe Tribe parties and all the Psytrance parties that were happening in the sort of 94 and 95.
Is that when you would sneak out of your home to go to them? Is that
right?
Well,
sneak. I would say I was staying at a person's house.
Okay.
And just happened to not stay at that person's house.
Did you ever get caught?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, kids aren't that good at duping parents. Especially I'm the youngest of 3 boys, so,
Right.
My parents were pretty wise to stuff by that age.
Yeah. Just on that again, though, when you returned to school on the Monday, did school just all of a sudden seem frivolous compared to this new world you discovered on weekends?
I mean, I would go to school blitzed. To a certain extent, and obviously I'm narcissistic in many ways, but I wanted people to know that I was sort of blitzed. I was already the outsider, I wasn't someone that got along with a lot of people. I think I was so incredibly shy. I would stay alone a lot of the time. People would think I was rude, but it was just because I was so incredibly shy. I could not fit in. It was a very much a sporting kind of school, and I was the least sporting person there. And I guess I just wanted to go deeper and deeper into being an outsider. And part of that is going to the parties on the weekends, hanging with much older people who were all quote unquote freaks. They would dress very differently to society and live this alternative life, a bit like, I guess, the 60s and 70s, the hippie trail that would take you through India and Goa and Cambodia and everything else. I had that feeling that that was what I was meant to be doing, was living a truly alternative lifestyle. And then I'd come back to school on the Monday and be in uniform, and all the other kids would have just had whatever they'd done on the weekend. And it was like a secret, I had this secret. And it empowered me in so many ways. I knew suddenly that there was an alternative.
That's a huge discovery at that age.
Yeah, it was
because
amazing.
School can seem all-consuming. There is no other world.
Oh, it's awful. And yeah, I loved movies, and I remember sitting in, I think it was commerce class. I can't remember if we took commerce class. And I had a flyer for Tetsuo, which is a Japanese film about a man that turns into a machine. And one of the kids ripped the flyer off my desk and was like reading it out and, just trying to ridicule me. And it just sort of emboldened me to go deeper into weirdness because, it's worked out pretty well, as it turns out. I never want to conform, really. I don't see the point in it. And I don't feel like anyone that's done great things has been much of a conformist.
Sure. I interrupted you before. Sorry, you were talking about PNAU and the early music which you made. You were sort of emulating what you would find at these doofs and you would hear on the weekend. And then, but at some point, you started to get your own identity.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think a little bit of it was implanted on us because we'd made a first record called Fractal Geometric Spaces Made Alight, which was never released.
Catchy title.
Really catchy, right? And then from that, we were working with a label called Peking Duck, that were part owned by a much larger label here called Creative Vibes, who were a distributor of all things funk and soul and disco and dance and trip hop, which was big at the time. And Pete, Pascal, and Heidi, can't remember her last name, terrible. Anyway, the two of them were huge vinyl collectors and very into disco and incredibly knowledgeable. We knew nothing about where dance music came from. We probably vaguely knew Kraftwerk. That was probably about it. And often I think when you're young, you only really know what you know, and you can't even see the edges of where that might came from. I came from industrial music, so I was more into that, and then into trance and techno. they introduced us to disco and I guess to black music in general, and to understand where it all came from. So we started sampling these records, and they were feeding us the right records to sample. So in a way, they were really curating us, exploding our minds into a world. And then through that, we came into house music. We heard the very first French house records, a long time before that was a household name, or French touch, or any of those things that came much later existed. And the filtered disco movement, which I guess if we had known more about it, then we would have gone through DJ Sneak and Derek Carter and that. But that happened later for us. But that changed everything. That what part of the art were you creating? You were sampling, so you hadn't done most of the work, but it was all about context, putting that in a new feeling, and then taking these tiny loops and putting a huge drum machine on it and all that stuff and playing it out. So there was a kind of crossover moment where we would play sets, and we only played a few outside of people's living rooms or on a beach somewhere, like in Kernell under the flight path, where we would play a few filtered disco things and a few trance things. And then the moment came where they put out our first album, which was called Samba Nova. And that's where everything changed. And, you know, we weren't aware. And I ran into someone, Hugh, he was a young kid at the time. He was working at Creative Vibes in the marketing department. I say marketing department, it was probably just him in the room. But he was really witnessing what was happening with that record, because they could see daily how it was getting picked up. It was getting played on radio all over the country. DJs were picking up on it, and it was this incredible groundswell. And I realized when something works, it's beyond your power. It's not about you being present in the moment. That music has a power of itself, and it was just reaching tons and tons and tons of people. I think we sold like 5,000 records in a week, and it was happening every week.
Wow.
All we wanted after we heard about the French scene was that we wanted, and Pete Pascal had come back from MIDEM, which is a conference in France for new music. He came back with a soccer ball that said Paris on it, and he sort of threw it to us. We were in the studio, and he said, you know, I want your music to come out in Europe. And we just thought, oh my God, Europe. Like this far-flung, incredible place where all this sort of magic happens. You know, I was a huge fan of the French New Wave and cinema and all that. And, you know, I never left the shores particularly. I think maybe I'd been to Noumea or like some island near Australia. And that's all we wanted.
Sure.
It's as much as we wanted was just to have our music come out in another country. That just seemed like the most incredible thing that could ever happen to us. And then Warner Brothers came along and bought the record off Peking Duck Creative Vibes. And yeah, and then everything kind of changed.
Yeah.
The gigs got bigger, and this record, it just kept rocketing further and further.
But it was bittersweet in some ways, because it won the
in many
ARIA.
ways.
ARIA
We
for
won the
Best
ARIA
Dance
award,
Release.
but it was pulled from the shelves that day.
That's right.
Because of legal issues we had because of the sampling.
Yeah.
And
so to put this in context for people outside of Australia, so the ARIAs are Australia's Grammys, effectively.
Right.
So your record wins Best Dance Release in 2000 at those awards. Huge publicity, huge exposure. And then that week or that day, the record gets pulled from the shelves because of these sampling issues.
Yeah, probably pulled and probably destroyed.
What do you do with that?
I mean, there's nothing you can do with that. I was living in the UK at the time. I flew back for 3 days from the UK, which is, 24 hours either way on a flight, won the ARIA and went back to England because Peter and I had fallen out. We didn't talk for 5 years at that point. The record was not for sale. Warner's had a hell of a time trying to clear everything. Some things could never be cleared. People just didn't want to know about it. Eventually, it did get reissued and re-released, and we had to change the artwork because even that was sampled. That was from another record cover. You couldn't have done more things wrong, but it established the name.
Did you learn a lot, though?
Yeah, it's weird. I often think of the 50 Cent album cover, Get Rich or Die Trying, and I feel like we didn't get rich, but we got the name to such a level that then shows would get booked, and then radio would look at a record, and that there was some brand awareness, and it changed our value. Suddenly I was worth something. And I put a band together and took the band out on the road for years. and the gigs, and then understanding live music and live gigs, because we were always making records. That was what it was all about. It was in a bedroom or under the stairs or wherever we were doing it. Suddenly it became about a performance, which was a very different gear from making records. But I really took to performance. I loved it. And I still love it to this day, although I find it more challenging now with my arthritis and everything else. But it was really that moment that changed everything. And I realized that this is what I did. It wasn't going to be a filmmaker. I left university and I just went on the road and made records. And through that process, met other producers, other DJs who then I collaborated with. And I would go back and forth to England to work with Darren Emerson, who had just recently left Underworld. And we started making an album. And through him, I met a ton of other people. We toured Japan and we toured parts of Europe. And I saw that the dance music world was actually a family. And you'd meet people, because you didn't really feel that in Australia. Yeah, there were mates and there were people. But on an international level, if you were coming in with a big-time DJ, and at the time I think he was one of the biggest DJs in the world, I would meet everyone. All those people you'd see on credits and on names and on posters, suddenly you were hanging out with, and they were treating you with respect. And it was life-changing to know that, oh no, they're all mates. They're all friends. This is a community. And you can call this person up and you can call that person up and you'll see them. You might see them in Prague one weekend and then Paris the next night and then Rome, and everyone knows each other and they're all moving. It's a global movement.
Sure.
It was so well established by that time, because this is 2000. They've had a decade of dance music, I guess, in that form.
And so different to your experiences at school. You're the outsider. Now fast forward several years, you're the insider.
Yeah. It was a phenomenal thing.
Yeah.
It really changed the way I looked at things. I don't think I'd achieved anything great yet, but it had opened the door. We made a difficult second album, and then I started a band called Teenager somewhere before that. I was trying to be a vocalist and trying to make, I guess, to respond to what was happening with the indie rock explosion of the Strokes and Black Rebel Motorcycle Club and all those other bands, and trying to make something in that ilk, to go back to the roots that I loved of Karen Finley Records and Throbbing Gristle, early Ministry, Skinny Puppy, and that whole melting pot of, I guess, in almost pre-acid house music, sort of early 80s, and bring that back through with Teenager, which didn't really particularly work, but it was a huge learning curve for me to try something with real musicians and take it live in a true sense.
Okay. One of the people you met, of course, and I'm sure someone you get asked a lot about, is Sir Elton John. You've mentioned, I think I saw a quote from you in the past where you said when you first met him, you had tea at the Rocks, and you said that the moment when he embraced you both physically, I guess yourself and Peter, and emotionally changed your lives forever. What was it about that meeting with Elton that had that effect on you?
Well, I think similar to the moment that Darren Emerson and I got together, I was suddenly being championed by someone who was larger than life. And there aren't really many artists who are larger in life on a global scale than Elton John, Sir Elton John, who've touched that many people. It's a validating experience. And it probably has a lot to do with being ridiculed and being an outsider at school, that suddenly someone who's thoroughly been an outsider through his career, but has brought so many people together, an untold amount of people he's reached and touched on the planet, that it changed my perception of what was possible. It reinstated the feeling that music was in truth magical, that it could change the world. And from that moment on, it was a clear shift in my existence. I moved to England, and then I was in rooms with the most famous people, the most successful people in music and the arts in general, and all the things that went along with that.
Like Robbie Williams, was that time?
Yeah, I didn't actually meet Robbie, but I worked on his records. But I had dinners with whoever the most famous people at the time were. And they didn't know who the fuck I was, but, you know, sort of irrelevant, I guess. But they were lovely. And it was like the dance music community, but on a much larger scale, because it was the most famous people in entertainment. And it's not rooms that I frequent, but I had some moments for sure, you know, where I was around those people.
Like, what did you learn in those moments? And can you be specific?
I guess I learned that a lot of them are very insecure, just like myself. I remember having dinner at the black and white ball at Elton's ball, and I was sitting on a round table with Elton and the heavyweight champion of the world and Justin Timberlake, some other people.
Okay.
I can't remember all the names. And I realized that, you know, some of them were incredibly uncomfortable and nervous, that you could get to that level. And we're still, I think all of us who are in this world, we're very fragile and nervous and unsure of themselves. That was the night that we found out that Michael Jackson had died. And Liz Taylor walked over and whispered in Elton's ear, and then he announced it to the table. It was an historic moment. I was there in the room at the same time. And Justin Timberlake was the biggest fan of Michael Jackson you can imagine. And he got up, he had to play at the ball. He was having dinner and it's like, okay, well now you have to go and perform. And you're not performing to an audience when you're playing to people at one of Elton's huge parties, because every single person there has achieved untold amounts.
Mm.
I can imagine that being a very difficult experience, to know that your hero has just died. And I think he did a cover of Off the Wall or something. I mean, you know, no one's really listening because they're all waffling about something or some or other. But I know for Justin, it must have been an incredibly difficult time.
Sure. I mean, it would have presumably sucked the life out of the room to an extent, that news.
Yeah. Yeah.
That insecurity that you talked about, the fact that people even at a certain level still have it, that brings me back to, you touched briefly on your Cirque du Soleil experience, which as Empire of the Sun was taking off, you decided to, I guess, not tour with that project and then instead go down this route with Cirque du Soleil and move to Montreal and work on that project for several years. What guides you in a decision like that? Because presumably, as you said, at one point when Empire broke through, you could have been sitting on the beach drinking cocktails or touring and playing in front of big audiences, but you decided to take on this other challenge.
It seemed a lot harder to do the Cirque du Soleil job. It also, I wanted to do something that was mine, that I didn't collaborate on. I'd had criticism, you know, and we all have criticism. It was weird. It was like going against the advice of my grandfather to a 9-year-old boy, and try and do something on my own and take on being the composer of a huge show. And it was a huge show. It was 9 747s that would fly around the world carrying the set and all the crew and everything. And we were at Radio City for 6 months, ended up being a year, and we're at the Kremlin for 6 months at a private theater, 5,500 people. Every single ticket sold out. We sold over 1 million tickets, and it lived in Las Vegas for years, 6 years, I think. They built a theater just for it. The problem was it was culturally somewhat of a black hole. It didn't, in the same way that popular music, it spreads to everyone. It was only those 1 million people that came and saw it that knew about it. But for me, it was just such a hugely complex and difficult thing to take on. It almost broke me, but it didn't. I think I did it because I think I threw myself into being an outsider again. When suddenly I'd made something that was so incredibly inclusive. And yeah, I could have done the victory lap around the world and had great experiences on tour and done all that. But I toured with PNAU, and I don't know. I feel like maybe I didn't deserve it.
In what way?
Yeah, it's probably that good old imposter syndrome that a lot of people suffer from or bring upon themselves. It didn't feel like that was what I should be doing. And my manager was very keen on me to try and do this thing. And I created some demos. I stayed up all night and brought in a large band in the UK. I think it was about a 15-piece band. And we made 5 songs, a demo that sounded unbelievable, I must say. They did sound so cool. Much wilder than any Cirque du Soleil thing. And the boss, Guy La Liberté, heard these demos and was blown away by them. And that I really wanted that to be what the show sounded like. But then you're entering into a massive corporate behemoth. It comes off much squeakier, much cleaner than you'd ever imagine. But I really wanted to bring that punk to it. Felt like that's what it needed. But it's a brand, you know. It's like coming into Coca-Cola and trying to make something completely different. You're not going to win, are you?
So what did you learn from all that experience, and how did you apply it to your career since?
I think I learned a lot about confidence going into a room of a lot of musicians and being able to stand up on a plinth and direct people and having confidence, and confidence is king. It's not something I'd ever really had in any sense, but if I'm in the environment of work, I can absolutely do it.
And you're composing, you've composed the music and you're directing the musicians?
I wasn't the musical director. That's always the band leader, but I was the composer. I had an assistant who could score it out for me because I can't write music. And he probably was so freaked out by how I wrote music because it was not normal. I took it on in a crazy way. I didn't take it on in a logical way. I was like a bull in a china shop. I ended up writing 170 pieces of music for it, for I think what ended up being 17 pieces of music. And each piece was about 9 minutes long. And you have to have so many changes because if the acrobats don't make this catch, then they have to go into a new section and then that section, and then which will bridge back to that section.
Wow.
I don't have musical theory, so it was challenging.
Yeah. But, you know, think about experiences like that, experiences with Elton, experiences with Empire of the Sun, PNAU. It all leads you to this place now where you have this incredible experience to impart on these young people. Was that one of the reasons why you feel so strongly the need to collaborate? Because you do have this wealth of knowledge now?
Yeah, I mean, I want to help people. I want to give back. And part of the thing was starting this label, Lab 78. We're signing young artists. I want to work with people that won't get signed, people that are outside the norm, not because they're not talented, because they don't fit into such a narrow set of criteria. And that hasn't changed a lot in my experience with the majors and the powerful companies. So I'm really going about and trying to find people who are different, I guess, who won't fit in, a bit like myself, and trying to raise them up. We have this amazing young singer from just outside of Newcastle called Janaba. We have a song coming up very soon with her, and she has an amazing voice. She's only 18. She's got a long way to go in terms of learning about the business, everything else, but I want to do the right thing by a lot of these kids. Deals that weren't offered to me at the time. We don't have the money that was around at the time. Not that as an independent you ever got the money anyway, but certainly we wouldn't have major money. But it was more about empowering them that if you do these things right, it can change your life. Like, here is the proof. And these kids have got the voice. So beyond having the talent, then it's really, for the most part, for me, is finding the young people who have the drive. That is the most important thing, that they turn up every day and they do it. And that's something I found somewhat challenging working with young people. And obviously it doesn't work out with everyone that we work with, but I think part of that is realizing that not everyone is the same and not everyone wants the same things. And that's taken me a long time to realize. If you have a gift, and everyone has a gift of some description, whether it's musical or otherwise, not everyone is going to do the work required to bring that gift to its fulfillment. So I don't know. We have these young kids from Tasmania we're working with who are fabulous. The singer Chloe from Sumner, the duo is called Sumner, and she's a real powerhouse, incredible performer, a great singer, and she's had a lot of challenges in her life. You know, she's got very bad epilepsy, and she's had a stroke and all these things. But when she gets on stage, she gives everything to it in ways I could never even have done when I was young, because she's physically strong and fit, but she'll jump off a riser and be like 4 meters in the air and then land and keep singing the whole time. I'm just thinking, oh my God, I started to get really nervous for her.
It seems though very fulfilling to you. Or is it as
I love it.
fulfilling?
I mean, I just want the best for them. It's so hard now in music to make to something financially meaningful. It just takes a really long time, and it probably always did. When you're in the thick of it, you don't notice that so much because you're getting, I got $300 more for this gig than I did last one. Oh, it's going up, it's going up. But I want everything for them right now, especially when you've had something really work. You just want that for them instantly.
Yeah.
I want people to be successful, and I want the world to know about these artists that are different to the ones that you're going to see on the top of the pops. It feels much like Hollywood. It's so narrow. We talk about inclusiveness, but we don't see a lot of it.
Just before we finish up, Jaxsta is all about giving credit where credit is due. Are there people that you would give credit to for helping you get where you are today?
I mean, so many. When just after Summer Nova came out, I met a record industry person by the name of Colin Daniels, who got me to do a remix for David Bridie, who was a singer-songwriter, but he came out of a band in the mid-'80s called Not Drowning Waving. And I was employed as a kind of co-producer or assistant producer on David's album. And David taught me untold amounts about music, composition, life, politics, really took me under his wing. He was incredible to me. And just seeing the work he would put in, the work in lyrics, he would have pads and pads and pads and pads. A bit like Leonard Cohen, I guess, where you write, 100 verses for a song that will have 3, just to get things right and get things so right. I keep revisiting that record and wishing that I had done a better job. But whatever, it was part of the journey. David was hugely influential on me. There's so many, so it's a little tough. Obviously, the ones I talked about, like Darren and Sir Elton, but then, Donnie Sloan, who did Walking on a Dream and We Are the People backing tracks. I mean, that changed his life, changed my life. Luke Steele, we've had a rocky relationship at times, but when we get together, we make love in music, and that will never change. We've changed each other's lives. He's probably changed mine more than I've changed his, but that's been an incredible experience. I've been working with Peter Mays since I was 14, and I owe him a tremendous amount. We're really like brothers in many ways. And then my brothers, Sam Littlemore and James Littlemore. Sam has been, he's been my biggest brother and a huge guide and influence on me over the years. Like any siblings, we've had, incredibly difficult times, but I've learned a lot from him and continue to do so. And he still guides me in ways and chastises me in other ways, but that's part of a learning experience. And then James, who's done most of my visual work, most of my clips and artwork, as well as just being such a beautiful, loving presence in my life. And when things go wrong, he's been amazing for me, as has Sam, in very different ways. And the three of us are incredibly different, but they've really helped me in so many ways. And I've been, a precocious little shit a lot of the time, I'm sure. But, they've always had time for me, and my parents have been amazing. They've been so incredibly patient, and having a messed up kid is not easy. One that's depressed and vocal about it. It's not always a great thing to be vocal about your depression, especially I'm 43 and I'm still going through the rigors of it. In the last 10 years, my wife, Gigi Rose Gray, is an illustrator and an artist. She's been incredible to lifting me up when I just do not feel like being lifted up. And then there are lots of other people in the business. Simon Moore, who introduced me to Luke initially and signed a project I had with Sam to Virgin at the time. We had like 2 singles. There's been so many people in the business. This guy that I signed Teenager to is a guy called Michael Danius, who's an unsung hero of the music business. He was the first person that signed UMI way back in the 80s. And he's looked after me in ways innumerable. And he's someone that runs a timber yard, but he also has run a label, and he does it purely out of benevolence. And through him, I've met a ton of other people and just had the support network there that, people have said, oh, I'm the squeaky wheel and I just need more support than others. And it's absolutely true. I'm often a mess, but I like to think I try and give back in other ways. And in more recent years, I've opened up much more to the Aboriginal plight and to people of color and tried to give money back in that way. And then more than money can only do so much, and a lot of it gets eaten up with administrative crap. I try and give my time and trying to do things right before I shell off this mortal coil. I want to just leave some kind of knowledge for those people and lift them up, because if you can get to a certain level, this music thing will take care of you as much as the business will try and tear that away from you. And there are so many people, or constructs, shall we say, legal constructs in the business that are thoroughly working against the artists. And I would love to see that change in some way and empower people. That's why I'm only signing people non-exclusively. I don't want to take people's whole careers. It's something that's annoyed a lot of people in my world in the deals that I've done, is that I have non-exclusive deals. I have Empire, I have PNAU, and I have my label. So I have Two Leaves Project, and I now have Cinema Sound, and then Teenager, and then a label and all that other stuff. Labels just want you to have one project and that's it. Well, the advice I always give to young people is have more than one project, because don't let them win. Like, why should they limit you in that way? And yeah, I know that most people, if they have success, they really have one thing and that's it. But it comes in other forms, in other ways, and it opens up the perception of what you might end up doing. David Bridie didn't start out as a film composer, but now he's done tons of work in that sphere. And if he had been signed exclusively and he could only do what he'd done, who knows where he might not have got to, and we wouldn't have these incredibly powerful and beautiful scores. People want to limit you.
Yeah.
And I find it awful and crushing. You should never, it's like crushing a flower. Like, why would you do that?
Yeah. Nick, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for letting me waffle for hours.
Not at all. It's been great to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you.
And that's it for another episode of Humans of Music. A big thanks to Nick for his time, and thank you for listening. This episode was mixed by Lachlan Mitchell from Parliament Studios in Annandale, and the incidental music and theme song were written and performed by Sam Lockwood. Please remember to subscribe to the Humans of Music podcast so you never miss an episode, or even better, share it amongst your friends and rate and review it. And remember, next time you need to know who wrote a song, who produced a song, who engineered it, who played on it, who sang on it, who did anything on it, head to jaxsta.com for all your official music credit information. Until the next episode of Humans of Music, I'm Rod Yates. Thanks for listening.